What's up, comrades and capitalists? Welcome to the Tolerant Left. We are going to answer the question, which economic system is more free? Socialism or capitalism? This is very hard to do in a short amount of time, but we are going to try to do it to the best of our ability. And I'm going to anchor the argument to what Milton Friedman said on the very first page of Capitalism and Freedom. There is no such thing as democratic socialism. So now, regardless of your political and economic views, I strongly suggest that everyone watches to the end of this video, because even though it seems like maybe I'm going too hard on the capitalists, it's because the claims that are being made were made by Milton Friedman, a neoclassical economist. So we are going to be debunking his claims, and we're also going to look at what Murray Rothbard has said about socialists, anarchists, and libertarians. And we're going to be comparing this with George Orwell and his thoughts on if democratic socialism is actually a thing or not. And please, everyone, like and subscribe. This is a new channel that I am trying to get rolling. But thank you very much for tuning in. We are doing something at the Tolerant Left that I feel like not too many people are doing, and that is looking at theory and history and current events and tying everything together instead of getting lost in the weeds about theory and it not really mattering so much anymore. But I also don't want to do what other people do, where they get too stuck in the left tube drama or the Trump drama and they kind of forget about the ideals that were set forth by the earlier thinkers. All right, let's dive right in. So to make the case that privatization of the economy is better for freedom than democracy is, Milton Friedman must equate democratic socialism with authoritarian socialism. So Friedman gets to work on this right off the bat. Right on page 1, Friedman makes the case that politics and economics are generally believed by people to be separate and largely unconnected. But he actually is trying to make the case that they are combined. So he is seeing the political compass that I know some people have done the test for. He's not really seeing like a libertarian left, a libertarian right, and an authoritarian left and right. He's seeing just one axis, a left wing and a right wing. And the right wing is going to be libertarian capitalism, and the left wing is authoritarian communism. That's not exactly what he's saying, but that's what he's getting at. So how he describes it is that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. That's what we believe. So when we believe this, the chief contemporary manifestation of this idea is the advocacy of democratic socialism by many who condemn out of hand the restrictions on individual freedom imposed by totalitarian socialism in Russia, and who are persuaded that it is possible for a country to adopt the essential features of Russian economic arrangements and yet to ensure individual freedom through political arrangements. But the thesis of this chapter is that such a view is a delusion, that there is an intimate connection between economics and politics, that only certain combinations of political and economic arrangements are possible, and that in particular a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic. So, of course, Friedman's making the case that you cannot have democratic socialism. It is only going to be authoritarian socialism or libertarian capitalism. But there is a major problem with Friedman's claim. A prominent feature of socialism has always been direct democracy and egalitarianism. So Friedman's claim that socialism is undemocratic only works against specific regimes, such as, well, as Friedman mentions, the Soviet model. So governments that sport a state capitalist or Marxist-Leninist system, whatever you want to call it, these political powerhouses that have only one political party, and especially when that one party practices democratic centralism, are going to come off as authoritarian. Now, an example of a one-party state would be the USSR, with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And power is very centralized in these one-party states, especially when they practice democratic centralism, because there are no competing political parties. In fact, there's not even really any competing plans. You're binded to the one party of the state and the one goal of that party. Now, this is a great system for progress and unity, but it's not a good system for freedom. So you can attack these regimes based on, hey, you guys only have one political party. There's not much political freedom there. It's very centralized. Now, democratic centralism, of course, centralizes that political power even further. So now this was a Leninist political strategy for progress. But once again, when you centralize the political power in order to have swifter progress, you're doing away with some level of political freedom and liberty. Now, all the party members are binded to consensus. Once consensus is reached, no dissent is allowed. An extreme example of this is Orwell's fictional Ingsoc Party in 1984. So Ingsoc, or English Socialism, was the only party in Oceania. All inter-party members are forced to support the same agenda, which constantly changes in order to support the party narrative. So this is an example of a one-party state that follows democratic centralism. So one could actually likely make the case that in 1984, Orwell was critiquing the Soviet Union, just like he did in Animal Farm. The really scary thing, though, that he made about the Ingsoc Party in 1984 is that the party narrative extends to all citizens. So even non-political actors must support the state through the party's decisions. So it's not just the inter-party members that are binded by democratic centralism, it's every member. So in America, this would be like, if it's not just the Democratic Party that has to all be on agreement about an issue for some type of political strategy. It would be like if mandated by law, we all must support this one decision made by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, whatever it is. So it's really scary. But now Orwell was a democratic socialist. So he would have actually accused Friedman of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because the Marxist-Leninist version of socialism in the Soviet Union may focus on progress and strength more than democracy and freedom, that does not mean that all forms of socialism are undemocratic or anti-freedom. Orwell actually believed that the true version of socialism was free and democratic. His character, Emmanuel Goldstein, was the enemy of Ingsoc, who claims that the party was actually anti-socialist. He thought that by rejecting populism and egalitarianism, the Ingsoc Party was rejecting the political principles of the socialist movement. So Emmanuel Goldstein actually became the enemy of the party and thus the enemy of the people for claiming that their society was anti-socialist. He was being a heretic. And inside of 1984, there's actually another book. There's a book written by the character Goldstein, and it's called The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. So, of course, from the perspective of a character in the book, it's like a nonfiction artifact that kind of exposes the whole conspiracy, and it's not really nonfiction, it's just Orwell making stuff up, but a lot of the geopolitical stuff in there is actually really relevant to today's society in America, I believe. So I think that would be a great idea for another video. But a lot of scholars actually think that Goldstein's book was supposed to resemble Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed. So there's a lot of cool ideas going on with this book. But of course, we don't get to read the whole thing because there's no whole thing. There's just an excerpt that Orwell had written for 1984. But anyways, one quote that I thought was really interesting and relevant here is Goldstein's quote that the two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. The purpose of sharing this quote is not solely to critique Marxism-Leninism, but to examine why neoclassicalists like Milton Friedman were scared of socialist regimes. They viewed them not as democratic grassroots movements, but as top-down authoritarian political entities. Democratic centralism makes in-party dissent futile to voice. Once a decision is made, it goes, and one-party states compounded this effect. So both Friedman and Orwell were skeptical of the degree of freedom enjoyed by the citizens of state capitalist or Marxist-Leninist countries, but they disagreed on definitions. Orwell saw the fictional world he created in 1984 as anti-socialist. He believed that the authoritarian one-party state was anti-socialist because it ostracized dissent. And the workers in 1984 did not own the means of production. The collectivized oligarchy did. The average citizens and workers had no say in the distribution of resources. The one-party state and inter-parties practice of democratic centralism solidified the citizens' lack of influence and the party's lack of accountability. Because of this, Orwell viewed Oceania as anti-democratic and thus anti-socialist. But for Friedman, this anti-democratic authoritarianism is socialism. He believes that democratic socialism is an oxymoron. He believes that the authoritarian command economy is the only form of socialism. But Orwell would disagree. Instead of using command economies as evidence that socialism is secretly authoritarianism, Orwell uses the authoritarianism of these regimes as evidence that they're not really socialist. So Orwell embraced the democratic socialist label to distinguish himself from the Leninists. But is this an accurate term? Is it possible to be a democratic socialist? In another book by George Orwell, this time a nonfiction book, Homage to Catalonia, we are given a look into the libertarian side of socialism. During the Spanish Civil War, Spain was being invaded by fascists at the same time that anarchists and disenfranchised socialists instigated a revolution. The main organization in this left-wing libertarian movement was the CNT, or the National Confederation of Workers. Orwell describes the three goals of the CNT as 1. Direct control of the industry by the workers of each industry. 2. Government by local committees and resistance to centralized authoritarianism. And 3. Hostility to the bourgeoisie and the church. Under this anarchist-influenced form of socialism, the economy was to be controlled by workers in a decentralized fashion, and likewise, government was to be carried out in a decentralized fashion. In both cases, there is a strong, embedded resistance to not just authoritarianism, but hierarchy itself. What Orwell describes is anarcho-syndicalism, which falls under the banner of libertarian socialism. So socialism can actually offer its participants more freedom than capitalism can, as libertarian socialism can operate in a flat playing field completely devoid of hierarchy. Whereas the quality of Soviet-style regimes come from a sort of uniform submission to the ruling class, the quality of libertarian societies is embedded in the horizontal democratic structure of both its economic and political systems. The third goal the CNT was trying to reach, hostility to the bourgeoisie and the church, seems aggressive, but when we account for the historical significance of the time and place, we see that this was actually a necessary anti-fascist measure, as the rich Catholics in 1930 Spain were likely to side with Franco. So it is possible for socialism to manifest in a form that is not only democratic in nature, but ruthlessly anti-authoritarian in practice. The kind of socialism advocated for by the anarchists of Spain in the 1930s may seem like a fringe form of socialism, but this actually used to be the norm. In fact, the first modern current of socialism is utopian socialism, and the utopian socialists did not believe in a dictatorship of the proletariat or even a strong centralized state. Utopian socialists like Robert Owen fought for an 8-hour workday as early as 1810, which is absolutely crazy if you think about it, because most other business owners at the time were just now getting over mercantilism, but they are still okay with slavery. So a lot of business owners at the time still had slaves, and here these utopian socialists were advocating for collective ownership of the means of production in a peaceful society. So to say that the utopian socialists were ahead of their time would be an understatement. In fact, by today's standards, they were still ahead of their time, despite having existed centuries ago, such as Robert Owen, who was born in May of 1771. They believed that no dangerous transfer of power from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat was necessary. Robert Owen was a textile manufacturer, and he believed that other owners of the means of production can simply be educated into giving up their economic power for the greater good. These early socialists were dismissed by Marxists as utopian because of their lack of concern for a class war or the need of a proletarian state. But their idea of collectivizing the means of production and living in peaceful communes was very influential on later libertarian socialist movements such as anarcho-collectivism, anarcho-syndicalism, and even social democracy, which has establishment recognition as political parties in many different countries today. Libertarian socialism was the main form of socialism until the rise of Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century. But around the time of the Vietnam War, a new left arose in America that was anti-war, anti-authoritarian, and embraced anarcho-syndicalism and other cooperative forms of socialism in contrast to the hard-headed nature of the USSR. So nowadays, the main forms of socialism that people advocate for are social democracy, which is not quite socialism, it's more of capitalism with a welfare state, but nonetheless, it's an example of socialist ideas coming into play. But we also have actual socialist movements, meaning They're not just capitalism with a band-aid on them, but they're actually the economic system is socialist as well. And those are going to be the anarcho-syndicalists, the anarcho-collectivists, communists, and the democratic socialists. And sometimes when people say democratic socialism, they're actually talking about democratic socialism. So they're talking about people like Orwell, who wanted the workers to own the means of production and for the citizens to be able to vote on where funds are allocated when appropriate. But sometimes when people talk about democratic socialism, such as in the case of Bernie Sanders, they're really talking about someone who, when they're in office, they can't really do democratic socialism, but they can maybe get pretty close to social democracy, which is capitalism with band-aids, essentially. It's like welfare capitalism. It's a capitalist system, but the citizens and the workers can vote on some type of resource management, but they're not going to do away with the profit motive or worker alienation for the most part. But in either case, what's interesting to note is that we are talking about libertarian socialism, because even when there is a state involved, we're not talking about command economies where the government controls everything. We're talking about democratic economies with a democratic liberalism political system. So they're closer to libertarian socialism by far than they are to this dictatorial approach. So despite what Fox News or the neoclassical economists would have you believe, authoritarian communism is not the norm for the left. Milton Friedman published Capitalism and Freedom in 1962, right around the same time that the anti-Soviet New Left was rising. So I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he was legitimately frightened of the left's embrace of Stalinism, and he wasn't intentionally misleading his readers to conflate socialism with authoritarianism. Perhaps the peace and love hippie movements of the New Left were not in full swing by the time that Friedman started writing Capitalism and Freedom. But when we examine what other neoclassicalists were writing, we find that they were intentionally appropriating language from the left to create this false dilemma of right-wing libertarianism versus left-wing totalitarianism. And in some cases, they were admitting that they were doing this deliberately. An example of this is a really telling quote that was in The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard. Now, this book was actually written in the early 1970s, but it was not published until 2007. But now we are able to look back and see what he said about the word libertarian. One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Libertarians had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists, that is, for anti-private property anarchists either of the communist or syndicalist variety. But now we had taken it over. Nowadays, in America especially, libertarianism is associated with conservatism and not economic progress. In fact, it is very common for me to hear people call libertarian socialism an oxymoron. But if only these people knew how hard they had been duped. Rothbard also committed a very similar act of thievery over the term anarchist. A good example of this is a speech that he did in 1974 at the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy in Washington, D.C. The next year, in 1975, this speech was published in the Libertarian Forum, Volume 7.1. This speech is commonly referred to as Society Without a State, and it features his definition of anarchist society. I define anarchist society as one where there is no legal possibility for coercive aggression against the person or property of any individual. Notice how he sneaks the word property in there? Well, anarchism is generally not propertarian ideology. Generally, anarchists believe that the means of production should be collectivized, but that citizens can retain personal property. But by Rothbard's definition, which is an exaggeration of individualist anarchism, anarchism is a society in which the means of production legally cannot be collectivized. He perverts this term to suit his propertarian narrative. In his anarcho-capitalist world, a corporate monopoly could conquer the whole planet, but to tax them would be against the idea of anarchism. But Rothbard knows that he is being dishonest. He admits that his side stole the term libertarian, and now he is caught pretty much stealing the term anarchist. He ignores the collectivist ideas of anarchism and instead exaggerates the individualist side of anarchism in such a way that even a lot of the original individualist anarchist thinkers would not be okay with. But that's not the only piece of evidence that we have that shows that the neoclassicalists appropriated these terms anarchist and libertarian. We also have a quote by Rothbard where he just straight up admits that he's not an anarchist. The funny thing, though, about these quotes is that they're usually not really in the center. You have to dig them up from old libertarian newsletters or pieces that were, written in the 50s or 60s but never quite got published. So it's like this idea of Rothbard and Milton Friedman stealing the terms libertarian, anarchist, but then never really actually thinking they were anarchists or libertarians. This is something that's happening, that's going on in the background that we're not really supposed to know about. But anyways, here's the quote. "We must therefore conclude that we are not anarchists and that those who call us anarchists are not on firm etymological ground and are being completely unhistorical." And to be fair, they might have not been deliberately trying to hide these quotes. There is a potential chance that they just never happened to get published, or they were published, but they're hard to dig up. And now they're easier to dig up now that we have the internet and we have some nosy leftists like myself and others who go back and look at these works, and then we say, hey, here you are just straight up admitting that you're not an anarchist, but then in this other journal that's a bit more in the limelight, you're strongly saying that you are an anarchist and you're going off of the individualist anarchist interpretation in order to support that claim. So for this quote that I just read, Rothbard wrote it in the 1950s, and his name in it was Aubrey Herbert. So, and that was in the periodical Faith and Freedom, and it was never published. So it's something he said that it's confirmed that he says it. No one, even Mises will tell you, yeah, he actually did write this, but he used a different name and it never got published. So it's just kind of weird. It's almost like they don't actually want to let the left side know, hey, we are stealing your terms and we're getting away with it. But occasionally they get caught bragging about it. So Friedman's argument that capitalism offers more political freedom than socialism does rests on the semantic trick of both redefining socialism to only apply to authoritarian command economies, and then also redefining libertarian and anarchist to be right-wing. But rhetorical tricks aside, which economic system supports freedom to a greater degree? Well, under capitalism, we like to believe that we choose our employer, but our employer actually chooses us. We are forced to pad our resume and compete with others in our social class to land a shot at climbing up the economic ladder. We essentially beg the capitalist class to let us make them money. When we do get the job, we are usually just paid a set salary or wage. We do not usually get a share of the profits, despite their very existence resting on our labor. And benefits such as health insurance are frequently tied to our employer. So if we were to leave, we would lose not only our survival funds, but also our health care. We may also work for this company for decades and still have no say over important decisions, or even trivial ones, such as who manages us and where we invest the profits. Private businesses are an extremely undemocratic organization. Yet Friedman has the nerve to call socialism undemocratic. The only way that Friedman can make socialism look worse than capitalism is by denying the existence of democratic socialism, or by conflating it with authoritarian state capitalism. Rothbard uses a similar trick by stealing the terms anarchist and libertarian from the left to make capitalism look like a libertarian ideology, when in reality it is nothing more than a perversion of ideology that leaves one bound to the whims of the supposedly free market.